Once you have your portrait traced, the next step is going to be starting to fill in the different sections with value change. So we're going to start with the darkest areas first. So everywhere that is completely black on your picture is going to be the areas that you're going to shade in first. So when you're shading, remember to choose your color scheme. So for my portrait, I'm using complementary color schemes. So I'm going to be using blue and orange. And this picture here that you can see on the screen is what my finished portrait looks like after adding in all of the black shadow areas with paint. You'll notice that I faded the value from dark to light. So remember that every section that you fill in, you need to have some sort of value change with your paint application. Or if you're using colored pencil or something else, that's fine too, but just make sure you're showing value change. And since this area is the darkest shadow area, you're going to want to make sure that it is the darkest application of paint. So that means if you're using watercolor, you're not using as much water and you're maybe going over it a few times to build your layers. If you're using the acrylic paint that was in your art kit, that means that you're going over that paint a couple of times too, making sure that it's thick and then adding more water and fading it out as you go. So try to start as dark as possible and just fill in each of those sections. So I'll go ahead and play this video time lapse so you can see this darker area starting to get filled in. You'll see that it does start fairly light. Watercolor is transparent, so it's for the most part see-through. And since this is the darkest shadow area, you want to make sure that it does end up being pretty dark. If this was the medium value area that I was starting to fill in, or the gray area, something like this would work, where it's not super dark, not super light. But again, you want to be going over this a few times to make sure that it is as dark as possible. And you'll notice as I get towards the outside in the background here, I am adding more and more water to the watercolor so that I can fade out that value change. So again, try to create a gradient like what we practiced, but on the larger scale here with your portrait as you fill things in. If you're using watercolor too, it might help to start with just water and put some water down on the paper. And that's going to really help to blend your gradients out as you're working with watercolor. But definitely use a small paintbrush. Try to be very detailed when you get into those smaller areas around the face. And try your best to, again, just make sure that you're building those layers, go over it a few times, and make it as dark as possible closer to the face. We will be eventually going over this again with charcoal or Sharpie to just emphasize the value change. So that should help if you are using a color like maybe yellow for the background or orange that's something lighter. But I would still recommend trying to at least start with a color in the shadows here that is a darker color. So blues work great, purples, but again, if you're maybe doing all yellow for your portrait, I would then just make it built up with many layers of paint and really try to emphasize the darker areas when you go back in with charcoal. Some of you will have a lot more detail than others in your picture, so just make sure that you're looking at every detail as you're filling things in. Look at areas on the face that are also completely black. So for example, I actually should have gone in and filled in the eye. I think I do that later on. But since that eye on the left is completely black in that area, I should have filled that little shape in as well. But eventually that will get filled in. But go ahead and fill in the darkest shadow area. Again, remember every section should have some value change. So start dark in the middle and then try to fade it out as you go.